Welcome. My name is Dan Jenkins, and I'm your moderator for this ILA Leadership Perspectives webinar. Today's webinar, Crisis Leadership in Higher Education, features Dr. Ralph Gigliotti. In addition to being the author of Crisis Leadership in Higher Education and Leadership Social Influence in Personal and Professional Settings, Ralph's article, Crisis Leadership, Education and Exploration, was featured in our ILA Pause for Pedagogy series in the ILA interface and included some spectacular tips on teaching and facilitating crisis-based topics in leadership education. So Ralph's also a great guy to engage in conversation with at the Global Conference or over your beverage of choice. Ralph, take it away.
All right, Dan. Thank you so much. Thanks so much to Shelley, Dan, and the ILA for the opportunity to offer some thoughts. Crisis leadership in higher education is a topic I've been giving a good deal of thought to. It's a research interest of mine and has been for some time. And the topic has certainly only grown in importance and significance over the last few weeks and last few months. I did want to begin by offering my thoughts and sincere thoughts to those of you who have been directly impacted by this unfolding crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic. Particularly those of you that have, dealt with some of the health issues or know of someone that has been dealing with any of the health-related issues. My thoughts are with you all. It's a challenging time for us all, and most certainly for those that are directly impacted by it. This is a disorienting time. It's an unsettling time. And as I'm going to attempt to highlight in my remarks based on the research that I've done, there is also a good deal of opportunity to be found during this challenging moment. So the agenda for our time together today, I want to allow enough time for some good conversation and Q&A in the second half of our webinar. But I do want to begin by sort of situating our conversation in this current moment and what it means for us in higher education. I also want to provide a research overview and summary of some of the central findings from my research on this topic to help to give our conversation some context. The implications will hopefully be useful for all of us as we navigate the complexity of this pandemic and what it means for higher education moving forward. And thanks to Dan for agreeing to moderate our webinar as well, moderate the conversation. So I spoke with the university president a few years back, and she started our conversation with the Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times." And she suggested that as a university leader, we are always living in interesting times. And I think that proverb is certainly relevant for the challenge that we find ourselves facing right now as we navigate a crisis unlike of the kind many of us have seen in our lifetimes. It is the crisis of our time, and the statistics are really staggering. As of this morning, there were over 370,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the US and over 1.3 million across the world. And that's data from the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. And the loss of life has also been quite staggering. What I find to be really paradoxical about this moment, and I'm situated in the Northeast United States, is you go outside and the trees and flowers are blooming and the weather is breaking and it's lovely out. And to juxtapose that with the really staggering and widespread loss of life is hard to reconcile. In higher education, we tend to experience crisis from a distance. A crisis happens in our environment and we're monitoring it and we're making sense of it. And some of us will have leadership implications and responsibilities for that time of crisis. What's most striking about this particular time is it has impacted all of us. And it will likely continue to impact us on a short-term basis and a long-term basis in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So let's talk a little bit about crisis. This is a webinar on crisis leadership. And generally, there is some consensus when we think about what a crisis might entail and how it might impact higher education. Most certainly, I think we all would agree that we are dealing with a really complex and arguably disastrous crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic. We also can consider the recent natural disasters caused by Hurricane Maria and the impact on the University of Puerto Rico and other institutions, and Hurricane Florence and the impact that had on the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, along with a whole host of other natural disasters that we easily can classify as a crisis. We also might consider some of the scandals that are oriented around sexual abuse at Penn State and Michigan State and a whole other host of institutions that have been wrestling with these really troubling circumstances. When we think about crisis, then, crises threaten the reputation of an institution. They disrupt our core mission and they place a prominent spotlight on the behaviors of formal leaders across the organization. When we think about how crisis is conceptualized in the literature, crises are unpredictable, yet not unexpected, according to Coombs. So as we're dealing with the pandemic currently, in what ways might have we predicted that a pandemic of this kind could impact higher education in such dramatic fashion? Interestingly, when we look at the etymological roots of crisis, it's one of the Chinese translations is dangerous opportunity, according to some of the scholars that have studied this. And I want us to use that etymological root as a way of understanding this particular crisis and what it might mean for higher education. It's dangerous, it's scary, it's unsettling, and it's disruptive. But what types of opportunities might emerge from this current moment in time? There's an interesting typology by Seymour and Moore that differentiates the Cobra crisis, which is the sudden disaster that sneaks up and attacks us, from the Python, the slow burning disasters. And to compare a September 11th type of attack with a tsunami, where you might have a little bit more warning to prepare for that. We could probably agree that the pandemic and the impact that it's had on us has probably been more of a Cobra in the sudden impact it's had on our institutions. Dan and I had a conversation several weeks back, and we were talking about COVID-19, and to envision the impact that it would have on us, I don't think either of us could have predicted. So in my research on crisis in higher education, this is the definition that I put forward, that crises are events or situations of significant magnitude that threaten reputations, impact the lives of those involved in the institution, disrupt the ways in which the organization functions, have a cascading influence on leadership responsibilities and obligations across units and divisions, and require an immediate response from leaders. So to think about the pandemic that we're all wrestling with right now and the impact that this might be having on enrollment, student services, academic affairs, alumni relations, fundraising, it cuts across the entirety of our institutions. My PhD is in communication. I've done a lot of work in the Center for Organizational Leadership at Rutgers with our founder, Brent Rubin, and lots of other colleagues at the center and Rutgers, looking at some of the connections between leadership and communication. And I want to offer two thoughts because an understanding of communication becomes really important for how we might make sense of the ways in which we enact leadership during times of crisis. The first is a quote by Fairhurst and Grant that describe how communication becomes much more than a simple transmission. It's a medium by which the negotiation and construction of meaning takes place. So as we think about the implications for crisis leadership, it's more than just what we say. It's more than just the messages that are delivered. But as we write about in some recent work, leadership's the design and implementation of messages, strategies, processes, and structures to facilitate social influence. There is a history that precedes each of us in our leadership roles and leadership functions, and that history matters in the ways in which leaders might use communication in a strategic way, but also using communication in helping others to make sense of the complexity that we find ourselves facing becomes a really important imperative for all of us. So this crisis comes at a really, it's a horrible crisis, and it comes at an awful time for higher education. And again, my paradigm in looking at this comes from sort of a Western US perspective. And I know that we have an international audience that might be watching the recording or here live that has been thinking about this for months now. It's an interesting time for higher education, and higher education itself is pretty unique. We have a lot of stakeholders, as we've thought a lot about in some of our work in the center, a diversity of internal and external stakeholders who are impacted by this pandemic and that have a stake in the work of higher education. As I'll share in a moment from some of my research, social media is playing a critical role in elevating situations to the level of crisis. And they also have given voice to those who might not have had as prominent of a voice in the past. I know this will vary based on institutional type and structure, but leadership and decision making in higher education are often distributed with shared governance and decentralized processes, which makes this topic all the more relevant for leaders across the entirety of the institution, not just those in formal senior level roles. And lastly, higher education is the subject of a great deal of criticism. Our perceptions of value are under attack. And it's interesting to think about what impact this crisis might have on the value of higher education, especially when we read the heroic stories of our academic health researchers on the front lines of dealing with this crisis and trying to find a vaccine for it, to the ways in which our facilities teams and student affairs teams have been engaged in efforts to try to build some community and support our local communities during such a challenging time. So we've been talking about crisis leadership, and you all come at this from different vantage points based on your backgrounds and based on your institutional experiences with crisis. Crisis leadership is a term that I use and others use that's a bit more expansive. There's a lot of writing that's done in the areas of crisis preparation, crisis prevention, crisis management, and crisis communication. And I tend to think about crisis leadership at a much higher, more expansive level, because again, it's not just the messages that are used to restore the reputation of an institution during times of crisis, but it's much deeper. It's much more systematic and much more cultural as well. So I know some of you are here because you're looking for some principles. What can I take back to my institutions to inform how we're handling this crisis, how we're talking to our teams in a virtual manner? What can we do to restore trust and credibility and faith during such a deeply troubling time? There's a lot of good writing out there that puts forward lots of valuable principles that you might use to navigate this disruption. Recognizing that every crisis is different, as a colleague at Rutgers, Mary O'Dowd, has offered several times, no two crises are the same. We want to plan for crisis, and you also want to test your response. And I know for some of us that might come a little too late if we haven't taken crisis preparation seriously before now. But we will likely face a whole myriad of crises in the future. In what ways can we learn from this to inform future training and development? You want to be mindful of communication goals and audiences, those audiences and goals that are intended and also those that are unintended. You want to draw on a reservoir of goodwill as a leader. In what ways are those relationships with stakeholders in place? How have they been cultivated? And what might they look forward? How might they move forward in the future? One of the central principles for crisis communication in particular is to communicate early, to acknowledge uncertainty. It's okay to not know the answer, and to assure the public in your engagement that you will maintain contact with them about current and future risk, an idea that Ulmer, Selno, and Seeger offer. Most critical, I would argue, is to tell the truth. And to, even if we don't know the answers and we don't know what the future might look like, to be honest and to be candid and to be concise and to frame situations before others can frame them on our behalf, but to approach it from a place of integrity and to develop an organized and coordinated approach to crisis management becomes really critical. And I know for all of us, we're sort of making sense of this as the crisis unfolds around us. This is a continuum that I offer in my book, and I hope it's valuable for you. It's in the book, Crisis Leadership in Higher Education. When you think about the communication that you're engaged in as a leader at your institution, or when you're monitoring the communication that surrounds us during this time, what is the approach to communication? Is it a compliance-centered perspective where we're focusing on the things that we have to say, or are we trying to enter into dialogue with those stakeholders who are directly impacted by this crisis? In this case, all of our students, faculty, and staff. Is the focus on ourselves? Again, if we view communication as a tool, as a linear tool, then the reputation is under attack. How can we use communication to try to repair or restore our reputation? That's only part of crisis leadership. I would argue that we need to be much more value-centered in our approach. We need to be honest, we need to be ethical, and we need to focus on the impact of the crisis on others and to approach our communication and our engagement with others from an ethic of care. And you can see underlying all of this, our communication is informed by the mission of our organizations and the values, our past experiences with crisis, recognizing that there's a precedent there that we will be judged by and perceived from based on past experiences with us and our communities, and the expectations of stakeholders. And I'll be really curious during the Q&A to see and gather thoughts on what you all are thinking in terms of how this crisis might unfold and the impact that it will have on higher education, recognizing the different vantage points and expectations that we bring to this conversation. So I want to allow lots of time for discussion and conversation, but I want to briefly summarize what I studied, how I studied it, and just some of the central themes that came out of my research. And then I'll turn things over to Dan to help to make sense of the questions that might be coming in regarding this topic. I was really interested in crisis leadership and the ways in which universities handle crises, and to study first what events or situations are characterized as crises in higher ed. How do these events or situations become defined and labeled as such? Research question 3 really focused on how we talk about crisis. Do we use that label regularly? And what kind of baggage does the term crisis bring to bear on our engagement with others? And lastly, really focuses on the training and development piece. In what ways can our organizations, particularly colleges and universities, better prepare for the next crisis? The book was published last year, and I hope the themes are really relevant now as we navigate this challenging moment. So I studied the first research question by doing a content analysis of Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Education, 2 higher ed trade publications, and a smaller sample of articles from other news outlets to understand better what they were using to describe crisis. What were the kinds of things that they were referring to? And for the second, third, and fourth questions, to speak to senior leaders from the AAU, the Association of American Universities, which are intense research universities in the US and in Canada. I won't go into a whole lot of detail here regarding my collection or my analysis, but suffice to say that there was a lot of data gathered, and it'd be really interesting to replicate this study in the aftermath of the COVID-19 case. So let me quickly walk through some of my major themes, and then we'll hand things over to Dan to moderate the conversation. First, what events or situations are characterized as crises in higher education? A couple of themes emerged from this study regarding that question. One, some crises are institution-based and others are environmental, and they're imposed on our institutions. We can most certainly think about the pandemic as something that has been brought onto our institutions. And regarding the second theme, the impact of it is not isolated to one unit, and rarely is a crisis isolated to one unit at our institutions. Rather, it requires shared decision-making because of the widespread impact. And lastly is crisis declaration. Who gets to call it a crisis? More often than not, others were referring to something as a crisis. In my case of the study, journalists were referring to the situation as a crisis, and senior leaders were less likely to refer to this situation impacting their institution as a crisis. And here are the crisis types that emerged from my study. These are crisis types that are most germane to higher education, and you can see they range from academic crises to athletics crises, financial crises, all the way down to student affairs crises and technological or facilities crises. I go into a whole lot more detail on these in the book. You'll see racial or identity conflict was one that really emerged as a prominent crisis during the time I was studying this work, with cases across the country of racial unrest across the college campus, particularly in the US. Secondly, how do these events or situations become defined and labeled as crises? Each of the senior leaders with whom I spoke offered different definitions of crisis, and viewed crisis through different and distinct lenses. I know we have a sizable population of the audience here today that's from student affairs, and the senior student affairs officials that I spoke with often had a higher threshold of what constituted crisis. If someone's life wasn't at risk, then it wasn't a crisis, according to some. And crises emerged as distinct from other events or situations or emergencies. Really interesting piece that I just want to highlight. Every single senior leader that I spoke with mentioned the impact of social media as being one that they're wrestling with the most at their institutions. They don't have a handle on it, and social media plays a critical role in elevating, accentuating, and really raising the stakes for what might be perceived to be a crisis. Which connects to my third research theme. I've been doing some writing recently on the perception of crisis and the reality of crisis. And at your institutions, we all are feeling this right now. There's a crisis and we don't know what the future will necessarily hold. But there will be crises in the future where there are varying perceptions of the potential impact. And if there's a sizable part of your population that views something or perceives something to be a crisis as a socially constructed phenomenon, it's a crisis that merits attention from senior leaders. Importantly, then, leaders play an important role and an important function in helping their constituents to make sense of crisis based on how we frame and bracket the situation. There's a lot of good writing on framing and bracketing and sense making that will be helpful for those of you that are interested in that topic. And lastly, crisis is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let me offer one quote from my study that really highlights what I mean by the self-fulfilling prophecy. I was speaking with a chief of staff at a university in the Midwest, United States, and this individual said, if I go to the president and I say this issue has the potential to become a full-blown crisis if this isn't addressed quickly, I want his antenna to go up because my use of that term is intentional. When we refer to something as a crisis, it can help us to engage in shortcuts as a leader. It can expedite decision making. It raises the stakes. The challenge, of course, is if everything's a crisis, then actually what might be a crisis that merits attention for the university. And lastly, what are the skills, values, and competencies that are most critical for the work of crisis leaders in higher education? I'm sure we'll get into some of this in the Q&A. There are a lot. I think what's really important for crisis leadership, particularly in this moment, is that we engage in a triaging of the emergency that's in front of us, while also making decisions that are long-term in nature, that are strategic in nature, that have the best interests of reinventing our institutions moving forward. Of course, showing care, displaying empathy, and building upon the trust and credibility that you might bring to your experience as a leader in higher ed is really critical. For those of us that do work in leadership development, I think the second and third theme there are going to be really encouraging. Every single senior leader that I spoke with mentioned, I've engaged in a little bit of leadership development, if any, and there's a need for more of it. The leadership development that I've been a part of is valuable, and I hope we can get more of it. And particularly in the area of crisis, the more we can do with that, the better our institutions will be. So I think we're going to be at a really defining moment for what crisis leadership development might look like in the aftermath of this pandemic. Let me close with a couple of last thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to you all for your questions. Some of the implications that came out of my research, and again, you can read more about it in the book. I'll highlight just a few of these now. The perception of others matters, especially if we consider crisis to be socially constructed. There's the need for high-performing and highly trained incident response teams, and I think we've seen some institutions responding in a really agile manner to what we're dealing with right now because of the training of these emergency response teams. What's really interesting, I write about the countercultural need for agility in the book. For those of you that do a lot of work in higher education, we have a reputation of being slow moving and deliberative by design, and crisis raises the stakes, and higher education is held to the same standards as any large corporation in responding to a crisis with the magnitude that it merits. And that's really interesting because when we look at this particular crisis, higher education is on the front lines of dealing with the crisis. We were often, at least from the US perspective, leading social distancing efforts in the very early stages of this crisis a few weeks ago. And I was participating in or attending a webinar a few weeks back with Inside Higher Ed, and Doug Letterman, who's the editor of Inside Higher Ed, suggested that the efforts of moving all of our instruction to remote delivery is nothing short of heroic, was the word that he used. So I think we're moving in ways that are agile and unprecedented for higher education. Let me close with two quotes here. The first comes from a really, really beautiful book called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit. And she offers this quote, and she writes about the human condition. And in the aftermath of crisis, and in the midst of crisis, what can happen to bring people together? She offers the quote that if paradise now arises in hell, it's because in the suspension of the usual order, in the failure of most systems, we are free to live and act another way. This is a defining moment for higher education. What will higher education look like when we're on the other side of this crisis? I'm thinking a lot of some interesting questions here about this idea of reinvention. Will this force us to be more lean and agile and creative and innovative and entrepreneurial in how we handle future crises and how we handle normal policies and procedures and practices for our institutions? What impact will this have on online learning, on student enrollment, on international education, on our traditional business model? And there's been a whole lot written on these very questions in the last few weeks that I think it's going to be just fascinating to observe. And I know that these are really scary times. I myself am scared and worried about the impact this will have on our communities and the impact it will have on our institutions. And I think this poem that is quite powerful. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It has gone viral over the last few weeks by a retired teacher. It's called An Awakening. And I'm viewing this as a moment of awakening. And she's calling it And the People Stayed Home. You could take a moment to read this. And when the danger passed and the people joined together again, they grieved their losses and made new choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. Crisis leadership is disruptive. It's also an opportunity here to use the values that we take seriously in higher education to address the crisis that's in front of us, protect our students and our faculty and staff, and look ahead to the ways in which higher education can best address the challenges of tomorrow and what tomorrow might have in store for us. So Dan, what questions are you seeing?
You're getting some great questions, Ralph, and great job. So the first one to get us started is a pretty interesting one, which is basically, how did we get here as institutions of higher education? And the questioner included some context from gentleman Ian Bremmer, who proposed that we've experienced a geopolitical recession where perhaps nations and special interests may have receded from shared public concerns, and perhaps that includes higher education. So, how does this help us understand our vulnerability to crises like COVID-19, as well as a way out and forward through this time?
Yeah, it's a really big question and an important question. Some initial thoughts. I think we've seen an erosion of trust in some of our public officials and at some of our institutions, an erosion of trust in terms of the stakeholders that we intend to serve. And I think that's damaged perceptions of higher education. And we also at the same time have seen over the years a limited emphasis on leadership development, and by not taking the topic seriously, and perhaps by being complacent at some of our institutions and taking some things for granted, I think it was perhaps a short-sighted approach. I think from the geopolitical perspective, it's really interesting to consider because there were warnings of a pandemic of this kind that perhaps were not taken uh, to the degree of seriousness that we might have hoped for. And I know a lot of this is retrospective because we're looking behind us to try to make sense of what we missed. But it's an important question, and I hope that if we look at this as an opportunity, a dangerous opportunity, we hopefully will be better prepared for the next crisis that we might face.
Thank you, Ralph. Yeah, so kind of building upon that, do you think that, a barrier to understanding the impact of the crisis or preparing for the crisis could be that sometimes colleges and universities operate as, fiefdoms in some cases?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. We do a lot of leadership development work in our Center for Organizational Leadership, and one of the books we worked on is a guide for leaders in higher ed. And some of the early chapters of that book really focus on the unique structure of higher education and the ways in which leaders might advance in higher education. And our structure is, someone a while back referred to us as medieval institutions, and it still comes through in so many of our practices. Yeah, so I think in some ways we've rested on our laurels, and that's not across higher education. There are places where innovation is inspiring, and again, the agility that we've seen higher ed at large respond to this crisis is most encouraging. But in what ways will we need to be more agile and innovative in the years ahead? So I think that's absolutely right, Dan.
Yeah. No, thank you for the insight there. So, and getting a lot of questions on this topic, how do we as university leaders triage some of these challenges? Um, are we prepared for similar crises and associated disruption? How do we prepare for something of this magnitude? Or is the response more relevant than the preparation?
Oh, yeah, really fascinating. Some of the interesting crisis management and crisis communication and crisis leadership writing that's been done looks at crisis in a couple of different domains: pre-crisis, the crisis phase, and post-crisis. And I think the triaging that we're dealing with right now is happening in the crisis phase. We're trying to respond and act while also making sense of the kind of impact that this is going to have on our institutions. What kind of impact will this have on fall enrollment, at least in the US and in Canada, in North America at large? What kind of impact will this look like in the fall? So a little bit of fortune telling, a lot of relying on science, but you're triaging in the moment. I think we're also triaging from a leadership capacity, with how we're leading our virtual teams, how we're leading our institutions to make sure that our people feel safe, that our faculty and staff and students feel heard and feel understood, and we all recognize that we're in this together. So that's the triaging that's happening in the moment. I do think what we should see in the aftermath of this is the work in organizational development and strategic planning and process improvement become all the more critical to revisit some of the central themes of what we've noticed from this crisis. In what ways did this impact us? How did our team handle it well? How did our institution handle it well? And to engage in honest and authentic dialogue around what we might do differently. What we might do differently if faced with a global pandemic, but also what might we do differently if we face some sort of technology crisis or a natural disaster. There are general insights to be learned from this situation.
Interesting. To kind of focus in a little bit, a couple questions about, how much of your research is institution specific. I think this, something like this current pandemic presents a crisis that is shared by institutions all over the world. Do you think this might change how leadership would tackle this type of challenge?
That's really an interesting question. The short answer is it should, right? I mean, there's a lot of value in studying leadership and in engaging in leadership development that's institution based, because we can look at things more with a more focused lens and more focused vantage point. And there are nuances of our institutions that we should attend to. But I think what this crisis reveals to us is the linkages across our institutions and the ways in which we're connected. And I think part of innovation and agility across higher ed is going to be forming more strategic partnerships across our higher education landscape. And that's a global landscape. So to think about crisis preparedness and leadership development from a more expansive place seems certainly merited.
Definitely. Kind of taking that one step further with context and institution specific in some ways. So one of our participants says, this situation seems to require, or at least suggest, that some institutions simplify and focus on their core mission and activities that meet that mission. We mentioned triage, if you will. So that means that a lot of individuals may be, unfortunately, quote unquote, non-essential, which has implications for mental health and seem to result in a lot of distracted efforts to recreate normal in the midst of this crisis. How do you think your work might address this?
Yeah, really another important dimension of this. Some of the research that's come out over the last couple of weeks studying university presidents and some of the worries on their mind. I know the Inside Higher Ed survey in particular focused on this. University presidents and senior leaders are really, really focused on the mental health implications of what we're seeing. I think as we consider the impact of a crisis of this kind on the work that's done across higher education, everything from athletics to student success to mental health of our faculty and our students and our staff. I think the idea and the central premise of leading with those values and that mission as a compass has never been more important. If we simply are reacting to the situation around us, trying to protect our reputation, it in the short term might pay off, but I don't think it has the long-term advantages that a mission-driven, values-driven approach might have. So to take seriously that mission and those values that have guided us for the last however many years that our institutions have existed, and to use that as a framework for how we're going to move forward.
Yeah, definitely. And thinking of moving forward, can you point to some good examples of crisis leadership in higher education? And the question asker said, quote unquote, or in parentheses, if there is such a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm a generally a positive person. To study crisis is a little bit it doesn't align all that well with my view of the world, but that's why I tend to see crisis as an opportunity for reinvention. A couple of things. There's been a lot of writing on institutions in New Orleans, and Scott Cohen as one particular model for how to handle a crisis in the aftermath of Katrina. So we could look at what's happening now across higher education and point to exemplars of effective senior leaders who have navigated this crisis. And I think some of the core ingredients would be they had trust and credibility preceding the crisis. So when addressing the crisis, they had that goodwill to draw upon. I think we've seen, I get emails from my various alma maters, and each of the responses has been about the uncertainty of this time, the importance of placing faith in one another and supporting one another, and also recognizing that higher education has arguably been never more important to figure out a cure to this illness, and also to educate the workforce of tomorrow. So I think there are lots of individuals that emerge as leaders in this particular moment in demonstrating leadership, but I also think collectively the responses that we've seen from organizations coming together to organize food drives and have blood drives and set up sort of gym space for additional hospital beds. The American university and higher education at large has played a critical role in navigating this crisis, and likely will do so in the weeks and months ahead.
Definitely. And thinking about what you've shared, not all institutions or leaders at institutions are going to make the right decisions at the right times, and there's going to be implications to that locally, regionally, online, face to face, you name it. So post pandemic, how do we foster a greater climate of trust and empowerment as educational leaders, or within our educational leaders?
Yeah, such an important question. Recognizing leadership is distributed as at our institutions is going to be really important. That leadership doesn't reside in a person or reside in a position, but it really is a process. And when we can think of leadership in that way, as many of us in ILA and across higher ed do, it opens us up to think about the ways in which multiple units and multiple departments and multiple institutions can come together to address the interconnected challenges of our time. So in the aftermath of the pandemic, I really think taking crisis leadership development even more seriously at our institutions is going to be really critical for our leadership development programs. And this is also for students to address crisis leadership. And I know, Dan, we were talking about this a few weeks ago. If we can have students start to think about crisis leadership in our courses and in our co-curricular offerings, it just sort of gets us primed to envision what are the kinds of things we might have to deal with, what are the competencies needed to do it effectively, and how can we learn from the challenges that we've navigated on a personal level and a professional level.
Yeah, definitely. Getting, similarly, a lot of questions about, not only leadership's response, but thinking about, looking forward. Will this change the way that we operate as institutions of higher education? Will we, is the way that we're centralized or decentralized? How will that impact, not only our response to crises, but our plans going forward? One participant says, nothing at my institution has slowed down for faculty or staff. What is leadership's responsibility in forcing folks to take a break, recharge, return to work? Why are we pretending this is business as usual?
Yeah, fascinating. And I think undoubtedly higher education in many ways will be different in the aftermath of this in terms of how we deliver education, perceived value of remote instruction and delivery of services, both curricular and co-curricular, the importance of mental health and supporting mental health initiatives. I think all of that will likely see some change in the aftermath of the crisis. I also suspect that this idea of self-care and well-being and wellness, which I know we've been talking a lot about at Rutgers, how do we care for one another? How do our institutions and the members of our institutions come together to support one another and to lean on one another, and to really breathe in the aftermath of this, to learn. We are learning organizations. It's what we all pride ourselves on doing. Let us use this as a laboratory to inwardly look at what we do and who we want to be and how we can learn so that we can be even better in the future.
Yeah, definitely. So, it had me reflecting on the quote that you left us with from Kitty O'Meara, and some of the questions are kind of in that vein about, will this pandemic accelerate higher education reform, for better or for worse? And, associatedly, one particular participant asked, with that, do you believe that the value of online and distance learning higher ed programs will now be more mainstream when compared to brick and mortar?
Yeah, so I've been reading every article that I've come across over the last couple of weeks on this topic. I've just been digesting and trying to make sense of what other experts are suggesting as well. I think issues of accountability, accessibility are going to be increasingly more important as we reform what higher education looks like and how we serve the diversity of students that should be a part of our organizations. The online learning piece is the one that's most fascinating to me, because one of the ones that's most fascinating to me, because in some ways, as others have suggested, what we're doing is not online learning, right? What we're doing is taking up an in-person course for the most part and trying to deliver it remotely. So there's a rigor and an instructional, pedagogical way of organizing a robust online learning course that that's well documented in the literature. So what we're doing is not effective online learning in most places. What we're doing is trying to still deliver content in a period of widespread disruption and uncertainty. So part of me thinks, will the workplace change because we can see that so much of our work can continue in a remote manner? Perhaps yes, but will that, what does the quality of the experience look like? So for faculty that are having a deeply negative experience using some of the LMS software and learning management software, system software that's out there, will they be turned off from online education because of how rushed it's been for all of us? So I don't know the answer to that. I think we're all going to give this more thought, though, in the aftermath of this.
Yeah, definitely. Not only how it impacts higher education generally, but how it impacts teaching leadership or management,
Yes.
with our own contexts.
So a little plug too, and there's a webinar available on the ILA website that Dan facilitated with Ryan Satterwhite a couple weeks ago, right, Dan, on teaching leadership
That's right.
online. So if the topic's of interest, it's a fascinating conversation and lots of good insights on how we continue to do this work in a mediated environment.
No, thank you for that, Ralph. So you talked a little bit about in the response to the last question about accessibility, and we've got quite a few questions on this theme, and I'll try to sum them up here. So as you're doing your research on crises, what did you learn about crises which have like disparate and by that the question askers mean like unequal or unfair impacts on certain groups or individuals versus other groups? Your wisdom, how will higher ed not further oppress those who are already oppressed during this situation?
Oh man, that thank you for the question. And I mentioned earlier that social media came up as a really important theme in a lot of the interviews that I was doing, because particularly for students who may not have had as prominent of a voice in their organizations in the past, they now can shape university policies and contribute to university themes, perhaps in ways that they may have never before because of the technologies that are available. So I think from a diversity and inclusion and access perspective, taking power and privilege seriously is an imperative across higher education, most certainly. And I think if you look at the themes that I've talked about today in terms of the social construction of crisis, the perception of crisis, in what ways are we responding to crises that are stakeholder centered and focused not just on the wealthiest of our population and not just on those with the most power and privilege, but all stakeholders that we call in part of our own in higher ed. So it's a really important consideration. And I think for all of our institutions that value diversity and inclusion, in the weeks and years ahead, we'll need to really highlight what that means and why it matters and how we're going to show that in our practices.
Definitely. And getting a theme too of folks that are saying, hey, if we want to contact Ralph, where can we do that? So if you would advance your slide, just one, I know that would give people a chance to reach out to you, as well as some requests for your slides and things of that nature, although the webinar
Absolutely.
a recording will be available for ILA members as well. So thank you for doing that. And then definitely a theme around, well, what if we can't return in the fall? How does this impact, or what impacts will this have on our institutions? How will leadership respond? I mean, some things are sacred, like, and I have a couple questions about, how will tenure and promotion be impacted? How do we help our colleagues dive into this? How do we de-escalate, not only for faculty and staff, but also for students, particularly perhaps those that didn't sign up for online education? How do we manage some of these things?
Yeah, so I think it's the question at top of mind at most of our institutions. I think most of our summer instruction, at least at most universities, has been moved to online or remote delivery. I know in most places there's been a cancellation of in-person summer experiences, or at least a delay of those until we have more certainty on when the virus will subside. And I think, and also an extension of our tenure and promotion policies because of the disruption. I know a lot of places are not considering the student evaluations from this past semester in considerations of tenure and promotion, which seems to be a wise decision. I think for all of us, and this is an honest and candid response that comes from my own reflection of what it means for a center at a university like my own. I think we need to make a case for the value that we bring. I think we need to make a case for articulating our story about what services we provide to the university and why they matter. And I do think it's incumbent on all of us to be more entrepreneurial, to be more innovative, and to look ahead at what we can do to elevate our departments, to elevate our units, to build some consensus around shared themes so that we can better articulate our story to ultimate decision makers and also to the stakeholders that we serve.
Definitely. Yeah, and just I'm hearing from ILA that so anyone who registered for the webinar is going to get access to a recording. So just sharing that. So, and thinking about our responses to this particular crisis and crisis leadership, in general, what do you think distinguishes leaders who are thriving in this moment from leaders who aren't? And I guess similarly, what are some qualities of institutions that are most likely to rise to this crisis? So I guess both thinking about it from the individual leaders perspective or behavior styles, what have you, as well as organizationally, what types of institutions are best poised to respond effectively.
Yeah, I love the question. The financial impact has been staggering, and depending on how the next couple of weeks unfold, it will likely continue to have just real devastating implications for higher education across the board. So of course, institutions that were financially challenged preceding the crisis are likely going to have the same set of challenges, only exacerbated as a result of the crisis, and that's sort of logical. I do think that a lot of these competencies that we've reflected on in this webinar, having built up trust and credibility as a leader, being mission-centered as a leader in an institution so that folks know that you're going to respond to things in ways that are aligned with the mission for why you stand and why you exist, and treating crisis as an opportunity are three that come to mind that are most critical. Because if we can, some have referred to crisis as a necessary corrective, and there are some issues with that definition, but there's a lot to unpack there. If crisis is a necessary corrective, in what ways can some of the policies and procedures and practices of our universities be improved based on what we learn from this situation? But I think it relies on being human and being trustworthy and being honest and acknowledging uncertainty, because we're all making sense of this at the same time.
Love that. Yeah, no, thank you for that context and that insight. So similarly, thinking about what might distinguish leaders and institutions that are going to respond effectively. What do you think is needed from programs like ours, leadership programs, leadership development programs, to prepare individuals to lead during a crisis going forward?
It's another really good question. I could talk for a while about this. I've been trying to do some writing. The one piece for Pause for Pedagogy is one. I just wrote something for ACUI on this as well, and for the evolution. And I think when we talk about what's needed for leadership education in this particular moment, I think we need to create opportunities for crisis leadership development. And again, crisis is broadly understood. So for students, what are the crises that your student club or organization might face? What are the kinds of personal crises that you've had to navigate? And what are the kinds of organizational crises that you've had to navigate in your own experiences? So to learn from those situations is really important. We offer a number of faculty and staff programs at our institutions, in particular our Rutgers Leadership Academy and our academic leadership program for our Rutgers Biomedical and Health Sciences. And crisis leadership is a prominent module in the programs. And I know that we've been flooded with feedback from our colleagues who went through the programs that that offer just some general good thoughts and notes of gratitude for having had an opportunity to think through this. We talked, Dan, a couple of weeks ago about the importance and value of experiential education. So to make sure that we're using crisis leadership development as an opportunity to really engage in some simulations or scenarios or practices so that we can become more comfortable with what's needed in times of crisis. And lastly, I think the more that we can emphasize some of these themes that I've written about and that I've reflected on today about the importance of values and mission and care and honesty and being other oriented and not just self-preoccupied, I think all of that can help to elevate the work that's done in leadership education.
That's great. Thank you, Ralph. Some themes too about, how did you, get kind of interested in this particular, topic, and what are some, what are some things that you're reading, scholars that you're reading, what are kind of your go-tos for this emerging area of crisis leadership, which is certainly front and center these days?
Sure. Yeah. I actually I did my undergrad at a university in Pittsburgh, Duquesne University, and I loved Duquesne and loved my experience there. And there was a campus tragedy when I was student body president, and the campus came together during a time of crisis. And to see how a university used the mission as an anchor during that crisis and looking at it from the perspective as a student leader was really compelling. I eventually went on to graduate school and did my doctoral work at Rutgers, and I did my master's at Villanova, where I worked in student affairs for a while. And this idea of crisis leadership and mission and values-based leadership and how communication plays an important role in that just continued to be an interest of mine. So I'm doing a lot of reading in some of the traditional places. I read Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Education every day. They've had some great coverage of this topic. I also like to read Harvard Business Review and Fast Company. I think they offer some really good perspectives on how other sectors are handling situations of this kind, because higher education is unique, but we also are not unique. We share a lot in common with other sectors, and we should be able to learn from other sectors. And I think those are sort of the most prominent places. And then just reading the literature as time permits in communication, higher ed, and of course, leadership.
Awesome, thank you. I think this will be our last question before we close out. But seeing a nice theme here about, from maybe a risk management or crisis management perspective, what would leadership of an organization look like if we were quote unquote like crisis led? In other words, is crisis leadership of value during normal times?
Yeah, I absolutely. I've heard a lot right now that we're socially distancing ourselves from one another, and yes, we're physically distancing ourselves from one another, but we should not be emotionally distancing ourselves from one another. And in response to that question, I think a crisis-led organization where crisis leadership and leadership more generally is taken seriously is one that values honest and authentic dialogue, and a place that takes perceptions seriously, and a place that talks about the mission and value of what you provide and live it in action so that we can learn to do that even better in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ralph. So we're in our last minute or so here. So Ralph, fantastic job. In closing, I just want to emphasize the importance of leadership, as well as regular and strategic communication during this and all crises, not only between and among you and your colleagues, your faculty, your staff, but also with your students. Set the example. Do the best you can. Some people say God only gives you what you can handle. And so to just be strong and be proactive and really focus on those relationships. So Ralph, thanks again. For your insight and also increasing our understanding of a very timely topic of crisis, not only generally but also in higher education, and really sharing some really insightful context. And finally, on behalf of the International Leadership Association, thank you so much for joining this Leadership Perspectives webinar.
Thank you so much.